Every now and then, you see a picture that perfectly encapsulates the decline of Western civilization and the damaging effects that multiculturalism and mass immigration has had on European nations. And this week, we saw one of those images come out of France. The picture of a 15-year-old boy of immigrant descent stood looming over his teacher and pointing a gun at her head as she was seated. And of course, the teacher was of European descent. This was a picture that said 1,000 words, and a picture that underlined exactly what nationalists have been saying about how multiculturalism and mass immigration have transformed European nations from homogeneous, high-trust, high-IQ societies into dangerous melting pots. And France is no stranger to this kind of horror. On the morning of New Year's Day this year, 2 French police officers, one of them female, were brutally attacked and beaten by a gang in a Paris suburb, leaving the female officer fighting for her life. This brutal attack even shocked France's effeminate and pro-immigration president, Emmanuel Macron, who referred to the incident as a cowardly lynching. But this shocking start to the year wasn't just an isolated incident. 2018 has seen multicultural France unravel at an alarming pace. In April, there were days of riots on the outskirts of the city of Toulouse, and then in July, the same thing happened in the city of Nantes, which was gripped with days of rioting and violence. And there has also been other incidents, including shootings, violent attacks, sexual assaults, and even the country's World Cup celebrations were marred by violent outbursts and riots. France is a nation in crisis. But this picture of a schoolboy holding a pistol over his teacher's head as she sat beneath him seems to have created more waves than many other incidents. And unlike many of the riots and other acts of violence that have occurred recently in France, this latest incident has actually been covered by a wider number of mainstream media outlets here in Britain and in America. And the way some of the media outlets have been covering this is hilarious. If anyone still doubted that the media has an agenda to keep pushing multiculturalism and pass off every single incident like this as something we should just accept, then the coverage of this story should erase any of those lingering doubts. But before we go over how the mainstream media have covered this incident, let's just have a quick rundown of what actually happened, so we can really see just how much damage control is being carried out by the fake news media. The pupil in question was a teenage boy of African descent, who had previously been marked absent from class. Presumably because he hadn't been turning up at all, or at the very least had been late on numerous occasions. And the reasoned response, if the boy didn't want to be marked as absent again, would be for the boy to alter his behaviour and to turn up to school on time. And to be fair, in this case, the boy did indeed alter his behaviour, but not in a positive way. He instead decided to bring a gun into school and then proceeded to stand over his teacher and ordered her to put her head down as if he was going to execute her. He then directed her to mark him as present for class. And as all this played out, his classmates seemed rather unfazed, and one even recorded the incident for good measure. But don't worry. The fake news media has assured us that not only was the gun fake, but that the whole incident was all one big joke. Yep, the little scamp was only kidding, and it was all a big laugh. The BBC, Britain's state broadcaster, led with the headline, and I quote, "French teen charged for pointing fake gun at teacher," end quote. The article assures us that the gun was fake and repeats this twice, the second time downgrading the gun to simply a weapon and reassuring the reader that the teacher continued to work on her laptop and speak to the class during the ordeal, implying that it probably wasn't all that bad because she just got on with her job. Time magazine ran with the headline, and I quote, "French teenager who threatened his teacher with a fake gun was charged," end quote. Curiously, Time magazine also chose an odd picture to illustrate the article with, an image of a march that took place in Paris in support of gun control in the US. No agenda there then. Interestingly, the article refers to the gun as being fake on 2 occasions, then goes on to refer to the gun as being an air gun on another 2 occasions. Which begs the question, was it a fake gun or was it an air gun? Because an air gun is not a fake gun, it's an air gun. And if you were to fire an air gun at someone's face or head at such close range, that person would end up, at the very least, with a nasty injury and a stint in hospital. But if it was an air gun, or more accurately, an air pistol, why did the BBC refer to it as a fake gun? As a quick Google search reveals that the BBC have run a number of stories on air guns and have never referred to them before as fake guns. But I suppose fake gun sounds a lot less threatening than air gun or even replica gun. And yes, there are numerous BBC articles that use the term replica gun. But by now, I think we all get the picture. The BBC use different terms to describe the same objects depending on how they want the public to view a news report. Whilst the majority of articles I found on the incident did refer to the gun as being fake in the banner headline, the Daily Mail did lead with a much more scathing title, and I quote, "Terrifying moment, French schoolboy, 15, points a gun at his teacher and shouts, 'Put your head down,' as if he was about to execute her, then claims it was a joke." End quote. However, despite the Daily Mail being initially more scathing and to the point, they do go on to reassure their readership that it was all a big joke, and the writer repeatedly refers to the gun as fake during the article, and not as an air gun or a replica. So that's the press roundup. But what has the French president, Emmanuel Macron, said about all of this? Well, fresh from his latest cringe-worthy photo shoots, where he surrounded himself with a number of half-naked African men whom he was eager to touch and embrace, he labelled the incident as unacceptable. Now, I would say that the boy being repeatedly late for school was unacceptable, but for the boy to bring a gun into school and then threaten to execute his teacher, that's something I would describe in much harsher terms. Something like that would rightfully be described as outrageous or sickening. But after all, this is the kind of boy that Emmanuel Macron would probably like to get half naked and pose with for a photo shoot. So no real wonder as to why his response was so tame. But what has been the response from the left? After all, every single time a gun gets brandished in an American school, there are marches, protests, and rallies, all calling for new firearms laws and gun confiscations. But not this time. This time is different, because France is already a nation with strict gun laws, and the person walking into the school and threatening to shoot people wasn't a white male. So this is totally different. And if there was to be a left-wing protest about this, I would wager it would probably be to pressure authorities to show leniency to the young prankster, as he was no doubt driven to such behaviour thanks to systemic racism, a lack of opportunities, etc., etc. You can fill in the blanks with the appropriate liberal drivel and excuses. But what do I think? Well, I think that this would have been covered in a much darker light by the press had the boy in question been of European descent. I also think, had the boy been of European descent, this story would have been run for much longer, and there would have been updates on it covering the boy's social media profiles, interviews with his classmates, and the press would have no doubt tried to paint him as a troubled extremist. And often, in these cases, the press will make some disturbing discovery that the young European fellow once saw a movie, played a video game, or read a book that had something to do with Nazis. He therefore had an obsession with Nazis and was also a Nazi, and it was all the fault of evil right-wing monsters who have been brainwashing children. But in this case, the boy was of African descent, and as such, every news outlet took pains to point out that he surrendered to authorities, and even that his father drove him to the police station. So as far as the press are concerned, case closed. I also think if this had been a young boy of European descent, the liberal political establishment and left-wing pressure groups would have been making a lot more noise about the case. And I also think there may have even been protests over gun ownership. But what if the case had been completely reversed? What if this had been a white boy pointing a replica gun or an air pistol at a black woman and threatening to execute her? What if the whole dynamic of this case was flipped on its head? Well, I think we all know what would have happened. This case would have been world news for weeks, and all my aforementioned predictions would have come to pass, with the media coverage being heavily tilted towards a narrative of how the case highlighted the terrible issues of racism, prejudice, and how Europeans are all evil, and how lovely, peaceful migrants are all victims of such racism and prejudice. Occurrences like this not only illustrate the way that multiculturalism and mass immigration have brought problems to Europe and the way that European society is breaking down, but they also illustrate the way that the press and the political establishment are so willing to play down such crimes when they are perpetrated by those of immigrant descent against those of European descent. These occurrences are also very illuminating for normal people, as the discerning viewer only has to imagine what the response would be were the races of the victims and the perpetrator reversed. Mass immigration and multiculturalism have brought a myriad of problems to Europe, and the fault lines within enriched European nations can now be seen clearly by all. What's more, it is clear to see that the media and the liberal establishment will do anything to play down violent incidents where Europeans are the victims in order to paper over the cracks in an attempt to convince the public that everything is just fine. But life in culturally enriched European towns and cities is anything but just fine. It is clear to see that European nations are being destroyed by a political and social plan designed to wreck those nations and erase the very people who built them. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this podcast, please help spread the message by liking and sharing it on social networks. If you want to hear more from me, please hit the subscribe button, as new videos are posted every week. You can also read my book, The Fall of Western Man. It's available as a free ebook and in both hardback and paperback, and all the links are in the description below. Finally, if you want to join in the discussion with me, feel free to add me on Facebook and follow me on Twitter. Also, you can now follow me on Gab, Minds and BitChute as well. Everyone's welcome.